Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the OSD Historical Office Speaker Series. My name's Glenn Asner. I'm the Deputy Chief Historian with the Historical Office. If you're wearing a badge, please remove it. We are recording today's event. Our speaker today, Colonel James Davitch, is a decorated Air Force officer with wide-ranging experiences and accomplishments. He's currently serving as the Deputy Executive Secretary in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. This is a critical job in supporting decision-making at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Over the course of his more than 20-year Air Force career, Colonel Davitch has helped lead ISR support for several major military operations, including Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom, and Inherent Resolve. Colonel Davitch has also been an educator, teaching at both the U.S. Air Force Academy and the U.S. Air Force Weapons School. His scholarly work has been equally significant. He's contributed to the Air Force Academy's main warfighting textbook and has written articles for several journals, including Joint Force Quarterly and the Air and Space Power Journal. Colonel Davitch has earned several degrees, including a bachelor's in international politics from Penn State University and a doctorate in governance and globalization at Virginia Tech University. In completion of his PhD at Virginia Tech last year, Colonel Davitch wrote a dissertation titled "A Shield in the Sky: The Vertical Geopolitics of Transcontinental Air Defense." His talk today is based on that dissertation work. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Davitch.
Hi, everyone. I would like to begin by setting expectations a lot lower than that introduction sounded. It took me a couple of years to go through this. I know there's a lot of no kidding legitimate scholars in the room, and I don't count myself as one of you because I've only really been able to dig into this in the last couple of years, and I know there's a lot more expertise in the room. So I appreciate any kind of Q&A as we go through, or maybe at the end if you want to ask afterwards, because I still have a lot to learn about this issue. I'll talk a little bit about how I came to this, but the first slide, this first graphic here is quote, is something I think you'll appreciate if you've been ever doing any kind of archival work, digging through various archives. You never find that smoking gun line that really backs up exactly what you're looking for. But I was going through my research on North American air defense, and I'm really pleased to see a couple of Canadian officers in the room. I think that I'd love to talk to you afterwards about some of the things that I bring up here. Looking through the archives and seeing that, you know, this feeling that I think that we kind of just sort of let air defense go in a couple of ways, especially in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I think we rebounded a little bit later in the Cold War, especially in the 80s and the Reagan years. But at the beginning, kind of occurred to me that it just seems like we kind of let air defense die. And then I go into the archives and I see a Senate Armed Services Committee testimony. Comptroller, the folks with the money have the best quotes in the archives. They tend to not have any filter, and they'll let you know what they think. He says, when we have a gap between military needs and resources, we can only resolve that gap in two ways. One, by being more efficient, or two, by accepting risk. We don't like to talk about risk. Therefore, you won't find it documented for the public because we don't want to scare anybody about the risks we're taking. Just quietly let air defense kind of die. Systems were phased out, but nobody told the people, you know, we have left you defenseless against this particular kind of attack. What he was talking about, this is in response to a question from Senator Lugar in 1983. He was talking about the defense against manned bomber attack. There was a time period that I'm going to talk about in the late 40s, early 50s, into the early 60s, where there was a real fear that the Soviet Union was going to launch a manned bomber attack against the United States. And one of the main points of my research and of this presentation is that somewhere around 1960 and 62, things started to taper off, and the United States, essentially, United States and Canada jointly, sort of let this program sort of wither away. And there's There's lots of reasons for that, and I'm going to talk about them as we go through here. This is the fancy title, and I have to begin because I'm terrified of the lawyers that work down the hall from me with my disclaimer. The views and opinions presented in this or implied in this presentation are mine alone, should not be construed as carrying the official sanction of the Department of Defense, the United States Air Force, or any other agencies or departments of the U.S. government. Now I'm safe. I'd also say, because I've got my mom, my dad, and my brother in the room, they're not responsible for this either, even though they've known me my whole life, or my wife, for that matter. Okay. So this is the presentation, A Shield in the Sky, the Making of North American Air Defense. I'm interested overall in the topic of air defense, continental defense, and I came to that interest from my experience working out at the Nellis Range. About 15 years ago, I had the best job in the Air Force, possibly the best job in the Department of Defense. My job was, the coolest job title. Moose, what was my job title? Remember? I was the Red Czar of the United States Air Force Weapons School, which meant that it was my job to coordinate all of the adversary activity that happened when we would do these big, huge, what we call large force exercises, LFEs, on the Nellis Range. There's Las Vegas down there at the bottom. You can't see because it looks better on my Mac than it does on a theater presentation here. But the way the exercises work is that I would tell the aggressor pilots, hey, I need you to take off here in the west, and I need you to take off at this time, and this is what I need you to do, to present this kind of presentation to the good guys who are going to, fly out towards you, toward red forces from the east. It was a great job. It gave me this understanding of how to think about air defense from a adversarial perspective, how our adversaries might think about it. If you're interested in reading more, I've got these little inset pictures as we go through here. Brian Lasley wrote a great book called The Air Force Way of War that goes into much greater detail on red flag. Anyway, so I'm used to doing these exercises in the Nellis Range, and then I read about this other exercise called Sky Shield that happened between 1960 and 1962, 3 times, 60, 61, and 62. Sky Shield was about 20 times the size of any exercise that I've been a part of out at Nellis. There was, at its peak, about 2,000 airplanes flying across the continental, across North America. The gist of it was we would have B-52s, another big, bomber aircraft, flying from the north near the Arctic Circle south towards Canada and the United States, and those B-52 bombers, those 3 are simulating about 500. They would be intercepted or met from interceptors in the south, about 1,500 of them flying north to greet them in this massive air war across the US and Canada. I'm not going to talk too much about the exercise because I'm personally more interested in the lead up to and the aftermath of the exercise. But we can talk about the exercise specifics later. I've got a lot of research on that too, if anybody wants to talk about it. Here's how they all pretty much work. They were all multi-phase events. They started off with step 1, grounding all of the aircraft across the United States. And that's interesting in and of itself because it's only happened 4 times in North America. Sky Shield 1, Sky Shield 2, Sky Shield 3, and September 11th. It's the only times where we've had all of the civilian aircraft across America and Canada on the ground, by law. We wouldn't let anybody fly. The next phase was the safe passage, which was essentially just getting the bombers, having the bombers take off and not getting shot down by the folks who are simulating surface-to-air missiles. And then the last phase was those arrows pointing toward another north to south, south to north war over the United States and Canada. And that took the majority of the exercise. Came in from all different angles, north, south, east, west, meaning even from the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. But for the most part, it was pretty much a north-south war at all different altitudes, presenting an interesting geometry and intercept problem for the interceptor forces. You see the players listed. I'll talk a little bit more about them. The Century Series aircraft and the F-89s, as well as the attacker, the bomber aircraft, mostly B-52s, but also B-47s, and also some British B-2 bombers, which is one of the most beautiful aircraft that's ever been created. And then also surface-to-air missiles in the form of the Nike series of SAMs that the Army operated and the Beaumark SAM that the Air Force operated. Just dwell on that for a second. There was a time period where you could join the Air Force and operate a surface-to-air missile across the northern part of the United States. And that was your primary job. And it was a nuclear carried a nuclear warhead. We'll talk a little bit more about those peculiarities. Oh, the slides here, that's the bow mark there on the left. It's over at the Smithsonian Udvar-Hazy Museum if you want to go check it out. The slide on the top right, that picture on the top right, is me putting in ChatGPT, hey, give me a picture of nuclear missiles being shot at, during the Sky Shield exercise. So technology. All right, so I'm digging into my research, and I read an initial article about this Sky Shield exercise, and it's massive, and it's got 2,000 aircraft, and I think, holy cow, I've never heard of anything like that. That's way bigger than anything I ever did out at Nellis. Sky Shield 1, Sky Shield 2, Sky Shield 3. And then I see this reference to Skyhawk, and for the longest time, I think it's a typo. Like these knuckleheads are talking about the Skyhawk exercise, they need Sky Shield. Turns out that it wasn't. It was actually an exercise. It was just canceled. There was also a whole series of exercises before that, Top Hand, Crackerjack, Checkpoint, Tailwind, and Signpost, dating back to 1952. And these are also massive exercises. Not as big as Sky Shield, but huge binational exercises with US and Canada. I started to develop some research questions, right? Why was this exercise canceled, right? Between 1958 and 1960 seems like an important time where you'd want to keep exercising. Why were there no more Sky Shields after 1962? And why did we do these in the first place? Why did we even stand them up in 1952 and hold these massive continental-wide exercises? So I've got some research questions. And when you're in the military and you're doing your PhD, you don't have a lot of time. And so once you find that, you're super excited because then you can start digging into the archives and answering the questions. So why did they start doing this? Led me to a very pivotal year in North American air defense. That's 1949. Here's a couple of things that happened. First, Soviet Union detonates their first atomic weapon. Second, they begin rolling out in large scale, what's the term for this? Batch production of the Tu-4 Bull. It's going to look to some of you like the B-29 bomber because it's a direct ripoff of the B-29 bomber that crash landed in the Soviet Union during World War II. Stalin says, make me 500 of those, and they did. And there's a great story that we'll get to later. If you want to read more about that, check out that book by Zuyev, MiG-29 pilot who defected from the Soviet Union. Great story, great anecdote about how they redesigned the So now the Soviets have a weapon in the atomic bomb. They've also got the bomber to be able to travel intercontinentally and levy a massive attack on the United States. And that starts to generate fear and anxiety. One of the other pieces of this too are academics get into the act. Academics start writing about how afraid we should be in US and Canada based on how close Russia is geographically to the United States. You're kind of thinking, no kidding. But it's interesting, in the research, they started, mostly political geographers, just started tilting the projection of North America, showing, hey, look, they're right over the top of the North Pole. There's a great book here called Mapping the Cold War that I pulled these from. This is a picture from Life magazine that was incredibly popular at the time, saying the US is there a way to? US, follow my thing here, is vulnerable here from Berlin and North America, vulnerable from Canada, vulnerable from the West Coast, from an attack from the Japanese or from adversaries in the Pacific, and then vulnerable from the South. People are getting these in their mailbox, and it's increasing the sense of fear and paranoia that an attack is coming. The military is saying the same things. This is Carl Spaatz, one of the early Air Force leaders, saying, there's pros and cons here. Through the Arctic, every industrialized country is within the reach of our strategic air, but America is similarly exposed, and I love this quote, we are, in fact, wide open at the top, which is going to be the title of the book if I ever write this. Carl Spaatz, this is Alexander D. Seversky. He's another Air Force, early Air Force theorist. Crazy, interesting backstory, too. He starts off as a Russian fighter pilot, gets in a plane, crashes in his first sortie, has a wooden leg for the rest of his life, and becomes comes to America and starts informing the United States Air Force on how we can do strategic bombing later. That was the nugget that I had from Air Force PME. When I really got the chance to dig into this in my doctoral dissertation, I found that he was one of the big advocates that the United States needed to build an integrated air defense system, or an IADS, to protect against Soviet attack. And his map, which is there in the top, starts to look very similar to what the academics are saying too, kind of pointing out geographically, we are in danger of this strategic attack and nobody is paying attention to it, or not enough people are paying attention to it. So you got this sense of vulnerability being driven by the scholarship come from the academic community as well as the military community. and President Eisenhower has to make a decision. He has to decide what he's going to do about this. Is he going to take it seriously? Is he going to build a defense, or is he going to maybe lean more on the offensive capabilities in the United States? Eisenhower sees the national strength of the United States as having a stool with three legs: military, morale, and economic being the three main components. And they have to be balanced or the stool falls over. He used this analogy a lot. He used it also to talk about the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. But nevertheless, he used it in this, and it worked really well for my dissertation. So quick thank you to the Historical Office for allowing me to find this kind of material. I got that quote from an interview that the OSD Historical Office did with John Eisenhower, Eisenhower's son, who told me that Dad believed there were three legs of the stool: the military, morale, and economics, and he thinks that they all need to be balanced. So thank you to the OSD Historical Office who's sponsoring this talk, and you should go look for this information because they have a million different oral histories with some really, really fascinating folks on their website. Okay, national strength is based on military, morale, and economics. So Eisenhower's response, at least from the military perspective, is to go on the offensive, right? To build an offensive capability, deterrence by punishment. Russia, Soviet Union, if you even think about attacking the United States, I'm going to smack you as hard as I can with my B-52s and our nuclear capability. That is one part of it. It's reinforced by pictures of the B-52, and popular media like Dr. Strangelove talks about taking the fight to the Soviet Union. And it's backed up in the slides that they're using at the time. So all of you staff folks in the audience that think that we're just doing this now and they didn't use PowerPoint before, they did. They just called them overhead slides, but they looked exactly the same as what I built this morning for the Secretary of Defense. The basic objectives of the military programs. This is a slide presented by the Joint Staff J3 for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to take over to the Hill. He says, our basic objectives, our military programs are: number one, to have a ready nuclear retaliatory capability. Check, right? We're all copying that. After every single bullet in the slides, though, it says we also need to have an adequate continental defense system. And so one of the key arguments that I'm trying to make from my soapbox is that the Continental Defense Network, maybe underwrote is a little bit too strong, but it's a significant component to this Cold War deterrence strategy. It's not all about the B-52. No offense to the bomber folks here in the crowd. There was also a significant defensive part of it. So what do you need for an adequate defense system? And that's Eisenhower kind of saying, I know we're not going to get a perfect defense. Just give me a little bit. Just let me defend a little bit so that I can get the B-52s airborne, which is essentially the plan. What do you need? You need two things in my mind: technology, and you need international partnership. One is easier than the other, and it's the technology piece that's easier. First, from a technological perspective, you need radars. You need a string of radars across the United States and Canada, starting with the DEW line, the distant early warning line, the mid-Canada line, some airborne early warning capability, and some picket ships out in the water with radars looking out, kind of providing that coverage of the US and Canada. Here's a great book talking about how radar saved us all in World War II. It's worth it. Next, you need weapons. So this is the defense in depth concept that the United States and Canada used, saying that, okay, from 100 miles out, the Air Force is going to be the first part of that defense in depth strategy. Think down here, this is the defended area. This is Ottawa. This is Washington, D.C. Next is going to be the Army defending us with the Nike Hercules system. And then as it gets closer, the Hawk and the AAA. So basically this arbitrary delineation at 100 nautical miles between service responsibilities. So from a fighter force perspective, you see the massive number of fighter squadrons. These are just interceptor squadrons too, by the way. 70 interceptor squadrons compared to 54 for the United States across the world right now in 20. And then from a surface-to-air missile perspective, you see the Beaumarks and you see the Nike and the Hawk systems with crazy long ranges, 430 nautical miles for the Beaumark SAM. This is a nuclear-armed surface-to-air missile, like I led off at the beginning with, shooting out to 430 miles. Primarily defending the Northeast corridor: Boston, Cleveland, Bridgeport, aka New London, Connecticut, New York City, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. And that kind of makes up the weapons used in this attack. How are we doing on time? Yeah. So I got a cool video. We'll see if this works. Oops. Bear with me. So that is the short version of it, and kind of explains to you exactly what they were trying to do. So the first would be the interceptors using the Genie air-to-air missile and backed up by the Beaumark system. And the reason was because the radars didn't have the kind of tight precision that you'd need, that we have now essentially, to be able to zoom in on a particular inbound adversary. So they had to get close. And when you know, that's why the nuclear air-to-air missile and surface-to-air missiles were used, because you can get close enough with the early technology missiles at the time. This is something I also found in the Uvar Hazy archives, and I just want to point out this is how to release the air-to-air nuclear missile. It says, to prevent flash blindness, concentrate on the instrument panel during escape maneuver. This is a different time, right? They think of new and interesting tactics to defend against this attack. But it just underscores how strongly people felt about the possibility that this attack was coming from the Soviet Union. Okay, the last piece is potentially the most interesting, and I think the absolutely most important part of the air defense architecture was the command and control. How do we make sure that we can communicate between all of the radars and all of the fighters and make sure, you know, we can keep things coordinated and organized? This system called SAGE, which was this gigantic 4-story building, there were 8 of them scattered across the United States, was responsible for that. It's kind of like an early air operations center for those of you that have worked in AOCs before. By almost any measure, scale, expense, or technical complexity or influence on future developments, the single most important project of the post-war decade was MIT's SAGE computerized air defense system. That's 100% true. This was the technological follow-on to the Manhattan Project and required about the same amount of materials and budgeting to be able to make it happen. And there were a million inventions that came out of it that I don't have time to get into, but you see them on the right side. Basically, I had to develop the field of computer engineering and certain elements of electrical engineering to make this computer architecture work. Fascinating. All right, that was the easy part. The tough part was being able to get on the same page between the United States and Canada, and there were problems on both sides. And it's worth a couple of seconds. This is a conversation largely between the two political leaders, Dwight Eisenhower and John Diefenbaker, the Prime Minister of Canada. But there's also an interesting component below the level of national government, at the kind of AO level, between captains and majors on both sides. The captains and majors in the United States and Canada on the same page, right? They're working well, and they're trying to bring about the best defense possible that was not always shared at the higher levels of the government between the two organizations. John Diefenbaker comes in on a wave of populism. He is elected essentially to, at least for one of the big reasons, to oppose some certain initiatives coming out of the United States, and not to feel like Canada is being drug along by the United States, especially in terms of certain militaristic activities the United States was trying to pursue at the time. Kind of skeptical about how the United States was thinking about militaristic approaches during the early Cold War. They want to pursue the diplomatic path. They're saying, hey, U.S., we've got a foreign ministerial meeting here in May 1959. That's going to be followed by Nixon going to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's coming in September 1959. And in June 1960, we're going to have this massive summit in Paris, where we're going to reach a great arms control agreement with the Soviet Union and start building towards peace. And Canada's looking at the United States and saying, what are you doing with these Sky Shield exercises? Knock this off. So Diefenbaker steps up in September 1959 and says, nope, Canada's not going to be a part of the Skyhawk exercises. We're invested in this diplomatic approach to reconciliation with the Soviet Union. And there's merit to that argument, but it really catches Washington off guard. Eisenhower sends a personal note back to John Diefenbaker saying, please, 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 this is a big component of our deterrent strategy to show the Soviet Union that we are not only offensive, we not only have offensive capabilities, but we have really strong defense. Eisenhower has got a problem dealing with his northern neighbor. He's also got problems at home. He's got folks in the United States, certain elements within the Defense Department, as well as Congress, talking about how the Soviets are ahead of us in ballistic missiles. Journalism, journalists saying the Eisenhower administration is gambling the American future, and an upstart American senator from Massachusetts who's saying that the United States is living within a period of peril and the White House is not protecting Eisenhower's not worried about it, though. He's not worried about being vulnerable or being nervous about the Soviet capabilities, but he can't tell anybody why. The reason that he's not worried as much as maybe people that don't have the information is because he has great capability from his ISR. I'm an intelligence officer. There we go. So he's got satellites. He's invested in overhead satellite capability. He's invested in airborne reconnaissance capability in terms of the U-2, still flying today. And he feels good because they've already basically proved that there's no missile gap, there's no bomber gap. It's just baloney being trumped up to create this impression that the United States is vulnerable. And he knows that we're not, but he can't tell anybody because it's super classified. He's going to do one more mission. This is the 24th mission over the Soviet Union. This is going to be the last mission before the Paris Peace Conference. That's going to give him the final, some of you are reading ahead. This is going to be the final mission over the Soviet Union. One last job, right? Called Operation Grand Slam. And that's going to reveal certain capabilities about the Soviet nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities. Going to take place, U-2 for the first time ever is going to fly out of Peshawar, Pakistan, overfly the nuclear facility at Sverdlovsk, and it's going to land all the way in Norway for the first time ever. All the previous ones had been out and backs, wherever they came from, mostly from Western Europe. So this is the Francis Gary Powers flight. It is shot down by after a volley of surface-to-air missiles launched at it that actually shot down their own Soviet interceptor at the same time, 2 weeks before the Paris summit. And the plane, the camera on board, Francis Gary Powers all come crashing to the ground, along with the hopes of the diplomatic community for this great rapprochement with the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, everybody shows up. All of the four powers, Paris, UK, the Soviets, and Eisenhower, they all show up to Paris. 2 days into it, Khrushchev throws a fit, storms out. Everybody in the United States is worried, oh man, now we're really in a bind because we needed to get this agreement with Canada. Now Canada's going to be even more mad, but it's not. John Diefenbaker is almost personally, sees this almost as a personal affront that Khrushchev stormed out of the summit, especially since he had invested so much time and effort into the diplomatic approach. So he comes back to the United States, literally, Prime Minister Diefenbaker gets on a plane, flies to Washington, meets with Eisenhower, and he says, I'm all on board. What do you need from me? And Eisenhower says, I want you to do the Sky Shield exercise. Remember the Skyhawk that we canceled? I want to do the next one. I want to call it Sky Shield to kind of differentiate it from everything that came before it. And Diefenbaker says, you got it, you're on board. And everything's great, and there's sunshine and rainbows, and everything's been fine ever since. So my argument is that just at the point now where we've reached an agreement between the United States and Canada to build this continental-wide defensive architecture downhill. And the reason is, so you got these successful national exercises, things are going good. I don't know what this y-axis is, call it mojo, right? This is like things are going well up through the 1960s. Skyhawk dips it a little bit, but then in the Sky Shield exercises, it's right at the top and it tends to go down. I don't even know if I like this slide, but that's kind of what I'm getting at. It was really at its peak there between 1960 and 1960. So I'm first doing the research. I'm like, oh, that's because of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Case closed. It actually had nothing to do with that because the elements for the decline in U.S. air defense existed way before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in fact, the Air Force, my service, was largely responsible for initiating that decline. The Air Force was responsible, the changing threat was responsible from bombers to missiles, and there was a change in nuclear strategy. And I think those are the three components that largely led to the decline. And that's all I'm going to say, and then I'll kind of wrap up. So for those of you that are hanging on, thank you. We're almost done. So the Air Force's changing priorities start to initiate the decline. Back in 1957, the Air Force commissioned this study by a general named Estes, who concludes that this whole architecture, and this is the Maginot line here in the World War I, right? The French build the Maginot line and the Germans just skirt around it, go down through the low country. He said, we built a tremendously expensive Maginot line, and it's the same thing that's going to happen now. So instead of that, the Air Force recommends recapitalizing, so putting new radars in old fighters, canceling SAGE, canceling the Beaumark surface-to-air missile, And that's kind of the first nail in the coffin. Also, through nobody's fault, the threat changed. The Soviet bombers never quite materialized the way that the U.S. thought that they would. U.S. intel thought that they would. NSC 6022 is a policy document that is written actually in the Eisenhower administration that says flatly, the period is drawing to an end when the primary threat to the U.S. is manned bombers. Threat is shifting. There's nothing to do with, there's no way to meet the threat right now because we don't have a ballistic missile defense system yet. So this is really just an admission that NORAD and the United States and Canada are admiring the problem that exists. We got these ballistic missiles. Somebody should do something about them. And then the last piece is the nuclear strategy changes. You go from Eisenhower's massive retaliation strategy to Kennedy's flexible response strategy. Kennedy comes into the audience or comes into the White House and says, I don't like this. I feel like my hands are tied because I have to respond to everything with massive, overwhelming force. I want to have a more flexible response. With that comes a relative deprioritization of NORAD and the North American air defense architecture. So those three things together mean that that all together starts contributing to the decline. So just to sum up, you've got the massive retaliation doctrine from the early Eisenhower administration points to the need for an adequate defense. That adequate defense is comprised of two things in my book: technological advances and diplomacy. And aerial surveillance led the United States to understand what exactly the threat was at the time. That shoot down on May 1st, 1960, led directly to the Sky Shield exercises that really represented the height of the US and Canadian Cold War architecture. That changed ultimately as a result of three things: the way the Air Force's priorities changed, the ballistic missile threat changed, and the White House's nuclear posture changed. So I go back to my initial quote here: we just quietly let air defense die. And that's why I argue it started to phase out in the 1960s. I think there are two biases that we can see sometimes when we're doing the research on air defense weapons, and I get made fun of a lot, mostly by my wife, for talking about this idea of vertical geopolitics. This is what I mean by it. We have a very horizontal way of looking at warfare, like land forces rolling across. Land forces rolling across internationally recognized borders. Think of it like a no trespassing sign. That's re-emphasized in graphics and maps that the military loves to show, showing forces rolling over. But there is a strong vertical component to all of these, to all warfare now, especially today, and we see that we see it just a week or two ago. I don't know if I want to get too far into this because it's too soon to draw any real strong conclusions, but I'm interested just professionally to see whether or not the way that the Israelis responded to attacks and then executed their own attacks presents an interesting combination of deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment, sort of what the Eisenhower administration was trying to think about in the 1950s. Again, too soon to tell on a lot of that, but I'm interested and I'm watching it. I have just a couple more slides that are unrelated. Some of you will appreciate when you're going and doing a lot of research, you have things that don't make the cut, and I'm never going to have another chance to talk about these science. So if you just bear with me, these are super interesting nuggets that I found in the course of my research that I couldn't put in my dissertation because my dissertation chair would have shot me in the face, and so nobody's going to know about them. So I want to talk about them. Okay, so the first, I was trying to identify when the United States had been involved in these kind of air defense exercises and activities in the past, and I found that in 1943, there was a attack on the western coast of the United States. There was a Japanese submarine that would go under the water like submarines do, and it had an airplane attached to the top of it. And it would surface off the coast of Oregon, and it launched an incendiary attack just outside the city of Brookings, Oregon. It was not successful, which is probably why you don't hear about it more. But I didn't know about it. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on a lot of these. So this is a question for the crowd. Which legendary U.S. Air Force fighter pilot ace, triple ace, was the Joint Staff Acquisition Officer for the Sky Shield exercises? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Your hero and mine had his name at the bottom of all of the Sky Shield documents as the AO. So again, for those of you in the crowd that are going through your staff assignments and you're hating life and you're thinking, this is so non-tactical. Robin Olds, triple ace from World War II and Vietnam, was cranking out the staff work in the J3 throughout his staff assignment at the Pentagon. So we all have to go through it. All right. This is interesting too from a PA perspective. So the Canadian and the United States State Departments are very nervous about things getting out in the lead up to the exercise that might antagonize relations with the Soviet Union. So they create a list of things. Yeah, say this. Say the exercise was defensive. Say the countries do this all over the world. No big deal here. Don't say the exercise was for offensive training. Don't say anything about nuclear weapons. They're like, okay, cool. We got our do list and we got our don't list. And then the United States promptly released the don't list to all of the newspapers. And the Prime Minister Diefenbaker in Canada is like, what are you doing? What? You released the don't list. And it almost derailed the first Sky Shield exercise. I also learned that there was a huge civil response to the air defense problem in the form of the Ground Observer Corps. Massive. 750,000 people across the United States would volunteer to climb on top of wooden posts across North America to look specifically for low altitude attacks from the Soviet Union because they didn't trust the radar. We didn't trust the radars that we had at the time and their low altitude capability. So we gave people binoculars or sometimes just Mark I eyeballs and said, look to the sky. And people did this all over the place, different time of civic involvement. So I talked about this a little bit briefly earlier. It's totally worth reading this book to find out more about it. Stalin gets this, he gets 3 B-29s that crash land in the Soviet Union during World War II. And he looks at his lead engineer, Mikoyan, and he says, build me 500 of these. And so they go through the first B-29, and they realize there's just weird things about it. Like it's got a hole in the side of it, but everybody's afraid to tell the boss. So they recreate all of the flaws in the B-29 500 times when they're building the Tu-4 Bull. Because they're, talk about you don't want to give your boss bad news. They don't want to give him, any news. Just, stunning. Okay, and you probably know this already. B-29, the Millennium Falcon design, same thing. Okay. Coming up towards the end here. So the United States really wanted Canada to take possession of nuclear weapons. And the Canadians really didn't want possession of these nuclear weapons. We talk about nuclear proliferation right now across the world and certain countries getting it and preventing other countries from getting it, and it's anti-proliferation push. I just thought this was a really interesting example that at one point in time, the United States was pushing these weapons to Canada, and Canada, to his defense said, no, we don't want these in Canadian soil, and it essentially led to Diefenbaker's loss in his for his next prime ministerial election. But good on him. He stuck to his principles. Miss Beaumark here on the right was an effort by the United States to kind of drum up support for having nuclear weapons in your hometown. And you had people writing in to their congressmen saying, I want a Beaumark. Why do they have a Beaumark over in Bismarck? This is a real thing because they wanted protection from nuclear surface-to-air missiles flying overhead. The first ballistic missile warning radar went online. I can't remember the date. But when it does, it had only been tested during the day. And so when the moon came over the horizon, the ballistic missile early warning radars see the moon and think, it's happening. Here comes the attack. The sirens go off and the lights start flashing. And finally, a couple of folks are like, wait. But on day one, it was very, very scary. And lastly, I learned that President Eisenhower's drinking rule was no more than 5 ounces of whiskey a day. And with that, I will encourage you all to enjoy your 5 ounces tonight on Friday night. That's it. So I got some time for questions. It was a mistake. but as anybody who's worked, on the staff, you can imagine, mistakes happen. It was just a stupid mistake. And whoever was in the public affairs office was probably like, oh my God, why did I even get out of bed today? Sir. Thank you. I meant largely money and attention was started to divert away from the air defense mission. This is a really hard point to prove because it's difficult to look through the budgeting, hard to look through how much money was allocated to different programs and say that was air defense, because it gets garbled together with everything else. My read is that just based on the amount of attention that I saw in documents like airman goes to the Hill and says these are our main priorities. That starts disappearing from the archival research after 1960, essentially, when Eisenhower leaves. Okay, sir. No, I think you're right, and I think maybe in the pursuit of an interesting story, I make it sound monocausal, or just I'm just highlighting the things that work or that are interesting. There's more involved for sure. Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, I have no argument. It's really well put. Ma'am? How this story should be talked about now, our air defense setup. Uh, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, the next phase of my research, I feel like I've gotten a good handle on 50s, and now I want to turn to the technology changes that happened in the 60s into Nixon's ABM, 70s into Reagan's Star Wars, and then what comes after that. That's I see this as progressing and leading toward that logical conclusion about what does all this history lead up to, and where are we now in terms of air defense? Yeah, Moose. I think so. So to gentleman's point earlier about different technologies being tested out at the same time, there's a really interesting inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Air Force at the time to develop new kind of capabilities and weapons. And so you get the Beaumark and the Nike. And Eisenhower looks at it and kind of says, why do we need two of these? Why are you each building your own weapon? And has a lot to do with phasing it out. But I think to a certain degree, it's about inter-service rivalry, inter-service budget share, and just trying to carve out a space for the Air Force versus the Army. It's zero sum. Does that answer your question? I think it'd be great to have it now, but declining budgets. Sure. So great questions. I did not plant this question, but that's a great question. And I wish I included more about those 2 points as we were going through here. To your first question about were there differences? Yes. So the first exercise was about 6 hours. It was very rudimentary compared to the next couple. The second exercise was 12 hours of flying. So basically took out the entire day across the United States and Canada of civilian aviation. And then the third exercise was, I think, about 8 hours. So a little bit more than the first and a little bit less than the second. So there's time difference between them. There was also a lot more participants in 2 and 3 than there were in the first Sky Shield exercise. There are also other peculiarities and interesting things about them, but we don't have time to get into all of them right now. But I swear I'm gonna finish this book and it'll have it in there. To your second question about the Soviets, the Soviets kind of went in with the idea that they're never going to be able to get what we have, right, as a continental-wide network of defenses. And so they kind of went all in on point defense capabilities over key regions rather than a nationwide integrated defense system. There's not a lot of in the archives that I could find, and I looked primarily at the open source CIA archives for what did the Soviets say about this. What they did say in their newspapers when they would present their rebuttal from their foreign ministry is that this is another example of American militarism. They're going to attack they're going to attack the Soviet Union. So kind of completely the opposite of what we were saying. We're going to get attacked by the Soviet Union, so we need to build these defenses. The Soviets looked at the Sky Shield exercise and said, see, look at these Americans. They're flying all these bombers, practicing this attack on the Soviet Union. So it's just kind of two countries talking past one another in some ways. In the back. Thank you. That's a great question. I feel uncomfortable getting into too many details, for a lot of reasons. But I'll say this. What I was trying to do was frame it in terms of deterrence theory, kind of like the academic way of thinking about it. My point was just that if you're thinking about it from deterrence by denial, I'm making it really difficult for you to attack me. Deterrence by punishment, if you attack me, I'm going to hit you as hard as I can back. I just thought it was an interesting way of kind of combining both of those two things in the course of 7 days, Israelis showing that they've got the capability to do both. As for the specific capabilities and the specific weapons involved, I think it's too soon to tell, and I'd rather not comment. Sir. I studied a little bit. They were just much smaller scale, almost more regional exercises rather than continental wide exercises. The number of participants was. I don't know. I shouldn't say. I'm not as conversant in those early exercises and how they were different. I think there was the AOs, the action officers in both the United States and Canada, kind of learning how to do integration. And I should say they were before NORAD. And so before there was a formalized real NORAD organization to kind of coordinate and quarterback the exercises. So they were, they were different in that they were maybe a little bit less coordinated, and certainly less coordinated amongst the governments. It seemed like the only time that at the national level the governments got involved was during the Sky Shield exercises. Sir. Sure. So I'm an intelligence officer, and I look at it from the perspective of that. What strikes me is how we misunderstood the adversary at the time and had maybe a more an incorrect understanding of what the adversary's capabilities were at the time. It's interesting to me because we spent a lot of money on intelligence capabilities to learn more about the adversary, but there was a strong I don't know, there's a lot of misunderstanding about how evolved the Soviet threat was at the time in terms of missiles and in terms of bomber aircraft. There's a whole lot to that. There's politics, there's just bad analysis, bad analytical work. But that's one of the takeaways that I have in terms of capabilities and modernization, was that we didn't do a very good job as intel folks, especially Air Force intel folks, if I can throw it back at my tribe, of really accurately categorizing the threat, to the detriment of the United States, defense as a whole. I'm not sure I totally answered your question, but that's where my mind went to. Okay, nice. Okay, sir. Hmm. Yeah. I think that ties nicely to Colonel Bergman's, who I see left. His question earlier was, do we need this capability now in like an Air Force surface-to-air missile capability? I don't know. It's beyond my way above my pay grade. But Yeah, I don't know. Sorry. I think that we have a gap in our capabilities in terms of what we're defending against, but I think that's largely driven by the threat now that is different. I don't think we have the same level of a threat against manned bombers that we did then. Some people make the argument about cruise missiles and different types of UAVs, threat changing and that. But yeah, I'm uncomfortable answering that for a couple of different reasons. One of the reasons that I did this study in the historical, archival research was so I didn't have to answer classification questions or anything that got close to it. So now I'm tap dancing, but that's why it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe I'll ask a question about the Cold War. Talisha? My brother, literally. Yes, Jerry. Yeah, that's great. It's a sharp jacket. It's a great question. NORAD SAC, Strategic Air Command, hated these exercises. All three of them. They thought this is a waste of time, a waste of energy, and a waste of our pilot hours, our training hours, because they're just basically flying, what we call red air. And who wants to do that? Because they're just practicing getting shot down. NORAD on the other side was saying, no, these are great. We need to keep doing these because this is a great training for our operators and our weapons controllers and the rest. So there was a constant fight between the two. And in the archives, it really comes out. The commander of Strategic Air Command at the time is saying, we're done with this. We're walking away. NORAD can do their own exercises. We're not going to supply the bombers anymore. It's very contentious. Again, a question I didn't plant, but I'm glad you asked. Thank you. Yeah, sure.